All right, I have tied my knot and pulled my thread through to the inside. I am now going to finish the bottom of the jacket, finish the band on the bottom of the jacket. Now remember, we did this different than what your pattern guide said, and in order to reduce bulk along my zipper, I open this seam up. In order to finish and attach the rest of the band, I need to have all my seams going the same direction. So I'm just going to reach up inside and now clip that seam allowance, which will allow that seam allowance from the band to now fold up, and so all of them can be heading the same direction. Okay, and you'll do that on both sides of the jacket. And then all you need to do is now line up that bottom side of the band and pin it to band and jacket. It will already be connected and folded up there at center front by the zipper. Got a clip there at the back. Make sure that you get back aligned. Depending upon ease, you'll find that you're going to have to stretch, just like we had to stretch the band in the first place to put it on. Stretch just a little bit to get that band to fit. And then pin that across. It will be easier if you pin it looking at your jacket, because you can see your jacket already has a stitching line that you will just now actually sew right on top of to attach this last piece of band, so that all the pieces of your band are attached together. So as soon as you've got it pinned and you feel good about it and there aren't any tucks, then you will go to the sewing machine and you will stitch that section together. Okay, now you're ready to sew the band to the jacket. So you'll just put this under the zipper foot, or put your presser foot down. You will not be able to get all the way back to the zipper. You can see that I've got my presser foot pushed back as far as I can get, and just pull your jacket back as far as you can get it. There will be a small gap that I'll show you when we finish here. And then we will talk about how we're going to solve that. And so you just literally are going to sew right on top of your stitching. So begin stitching, back stitch. And if you look right there at your presser foot, you've got a groove in the center of your presser foot. If you let that groove go right on top of your stitching, your second row of stitching will line up and be right on top of your first row. And you continue and sew all the way to the other side of the band, doing the same thing as you approach the other side of the band. You will not be able to go clear to the end. You'll just go as far as you can go. Like I said, there will be a little teeny tiny spot. My stitching ended right there, and so I've got about 1/2 inch on each side that I could not get into. In order to close that gap, that happens as we welt this seam to one side. And so check on the right side, check your band, get out your hem gauge, make sure your band stays that same width along the entire length of your jacket, that your band doesn't get fatter and skinnier as you're heading across the jacket there. And so just pull that, check that, and make sure that you are good. And as long as the width of your band is good, then you are ready to go to the next step, and that will be to welt the seam. All right, so the band is now completely sewn to the bottom. All the layers are sewn, checked and measured to make sure that the band is the same width. This now is going to become a welt seam unless you have a fabric and you're using a fabric where your band does not stretch, in which case you will have to just double stitch it, because as you pull that up, if you can't get any stretch, you're going to wind up with tucks and puckers as you try to pull that band up. But my fabric has plenty of stretch in it. And so the seam that's going to be, we're going to follow widest to the world, except that this last piece of seam allowance here that normally would be the very inside and be the shortest, we're not going to trim that at all because it's going to come up and weld over the top and cover everything up when the time comes. And so you'll take your seam allowance, and the one that's going to be closest to your jacket you will trim to just about 1/4 of an inch, and the first side of the band you will trim to just less than 1/4 of an inch, and then you'll take the entire band and trim that and lay that up over the top. And so trimming the jacket first, and again, when you're sewing with a knit, the nice thing is you don't have to worry much about fraying. And so I'm going to be cutting off just more than 1/4 of an inch from the jacket, and then from the band I want to be just under 1/4 of an inch, trimming that off. So you can see my jacket is a little bit longer. My band lays on the top of that, and then the second part of the band is going to come up and completely cover all of them in order to get trimmed and put in place, or in order to be welted and then put in place. And so I will continue to trim that off camera, but that's what the rest of the jacket, that's what's going to happen to the rest of the jacket. Again, jacket gets trimmed to just barely under 1/4, and the first part of your band here gets trimmed to about 3/16 or so, between 1/4 and an 1/8, and that piece gets left full, and then we'll be ready to welt it. The band is now, and the jacket are now trimmed and graded. Jacket again, just over 1/4. First part of the band is just under 1/4. Second part of the band still at 5/8. And now you're going to take that band and pin it, that seam allowance from the band, and pin it up over. And notice I am reaching up, but you can't see my fingers behind. I've got these fingers, and I'm actually pressing the fabric in between my thumb and my fingers, trying to flatten that out and get my seam here as flat as I possibly can get it, pressing against that hard surface. And so if you'll use the top of your sewing board or your pressing board so that you can push down and give it a pretty good flatten out as you're pinning this together to flatten that seam down to create this welt seam. And you will do this the entire length of the jacket, giving a really good firm hard press and pushing it. Go part of the distance, then actually turn your jacket over and look and make sure that you've kept this seam allowance here well defined. And by that I mean you haven't allowed the jacket to bubble down and have a bubble or extra fabric sitting there, that it's laying quite flat. When you can see there's a pin and a pin, you can see where those dimples are, where the pins are, that I've got that seam pulled out and have defined it very well, that I didn't get a pin caught and have a bubble down in here. So periodically turn your jacket over and look, make sure it's flat, make sure it looks good. So when you are completely pinned, you've checked it, it's pinned flat, you've turned it over, checked and made sure that that seam line is very well defined on both sides. You're now ready to stitch your welt seam from the right side. So you'll come to your sewing machine, line this up, and if you remember, we had this little hole here where we couldn't get all the way sewn. We've got about that 1/2 inch gap. This is where through the welt seam we're going to actually close that gap so that there won't be a hole going down into the front edge there. I kind of like to drop my stitch into the same seam where I have, or the stitching line where I'd sewed my zipper, rather than cross it. You can do either one, but I like to kind of end it where it's sewn, and so I usually stop there. And we're not going to backstitch because this shows on the right side. Because I pinned from the inside to make sure that my fleece seam was laying out flat, I do have to reach up underneath and take the pins out. Some people like to pin from the outside, so the pins are sitting right up there where you can see them. Either method works fine. You can do whichever works easiest for you. Actually, if this is the first jacket you've made, pin part of it from the inside, part from the outside, so that you can see and learn which method, which way you like to work, and which makes it easier for you to make sure that you don't get tucks or you don't get the piece of seam folding back down on itself. And so we are going to simply continue to sew across the bottom of this jacket, welting the seam up towards the jacket. And again, this seam only works if the band itself has some stretch to be able to become as large, the circumference become as large as the circumference of the jacket. If the band does not have enough give, you will get all kinds of tucks and puckers along this edge here that don't look very attractive. And you will need to use just sew that seam, doing the double seam finish that you saw at the beginning of this construction process. So I'm going to continue to sew this and get back with you in a minute. When you're done then, you will have a row of stitching, 1/4 inch from that edge. You will take your thread, pull your thread through, tie a knot, and then on the inside you've got a welted seam, and so you're going to have this lip of fabric that you've had on your other welted seams, and you will simply now come back with your scissors and you are going to trim that welted seam close to the stitching. And so just take your scissors, trim into that, again being careful not to cut your jacket, and just trim that edge off close to your stitching line. You can trim close again because this knitted fabric, a stable knit, doesn't tend to ravel, doesn't tend to fray. And so you would trim that off all the way across. And I'm just going to go that far and finish trimming it. Well, you weren't watching, but you would get that trimmed so that it's stitched down in place and you don't have that edge flipping like I've got right here, where I have no edge flipping here. I will continue to trim that. When you've got that trimmed, then your band is completed and you're ready to go to your cuffs.